Hi everyone, this is Yana Smakula and welcome to another Altenew card making video tutorial. Today I'm inviting you to use your floral stamps to create stunning vintage-like stamped patterns for your cards. Patterns like these work for many different occasions and you can create just about any card by simply using a different sentiment. Here's a look at one of the patterns that I created, and I'll show you how to stamp this exact one in this video. And I'll share some tips on how to make this stamping go as fast as possible or take as little time as possible. And before we get started, I also wanted to show you my test piece. I wasn't sure about the placement of the roses or the colors, so I tried a few options before I stamped the actual pattern. And this is something I always do. I always test stamp my ideas. You can see that the colors that I originally picked looked a little bit too dark, especially that red coral color and the dark gray. These look fine for other projects, but for my vintage floral pattern, I wanted to use something a bit softer. So let's go ahead and first pick the colors for our project. It's always nice to have an ink chart on hand to be able to easily tell the color of inks you have. And here I have mine with Altenew inks. I will be using blush, frosty pink, cotton candy for one of the flowers, and also peach, rouge, and blush once again for another flower. For the leaves, instead of traditional greens, I'm going with the lighter blues. I will be using sea glass and ocean waves. You can also use a soft lilac and say combine it with the morning frost for a very light and soft look on your project. So the stamp set I'm using is Altenew's Vintage Roses, and I'll be using this one rose at the top, this one rose at the bottom, and it actually has 4 layers, but I will omit the first layer and will use the second layer as the first one. And I'll also use one other small rose from this set. So I've mounted the first layers of my roses and also the first layers of my leaves onto clear blocks. Using clear blocks instead of a stamping tool such as MISTI is actually faster for this particular technique, but by all means you can use MISTI for this as well, especially if you're mass producing this pattern or your stamp set is brand new and it doesn't take the color, the ink well yet. So the idea is to first stamp the base layer of all images, so a base layer for all of the flowers and all of the leaves, and then come in and color those layers. And by color, I mean stamp additional second and third layers to add details and additional color. I'm starting with the largest rose in blush ink and stamping the first rose in the middle of my white panel. This panel is cut to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. Next, I'm going to add the second rose. This is the one where I'm skipping the first layer and using the second one as the first one. And again, I'm using blush ink and also stamping the third rose. I'm leaving quite a bit of space in between the roses to be able to add leaves later. I'm also changing the direction which my roses are facing. This creates movement and variety on the background and it makes it look more natural. So continue stamping the roses, alternate the sizes and direction. Note that I'm using the same color of ink for the base layer. I'm using blush. This makes it very easy to stamp everything quickly. I don't need to worry about inking my stamp with the wrong color of ink and messing up this panel, which I actually did the first time I was stamping it. So this doesn't look like much at first. In fact, it doesn't look pretty at all. But as we start adding leaves and layers, it's going to change completely. So I'm going to use the light blue, sea glass, and stamp leaves next to every rose on my panel. I'm mixing several leaf sizes here. I have one large leaf and a few smaller leaves. You don't want to use every image from your stamp set as it would just take too much time and it would be too confusing in terms of stamping and layering. But you do want to make sure to use at least 2 different leaves. I'm using 3 here and also adding one tiny 4th leaf to the cluster. So the base layer is done and our panel is ready to be colored. I'm going to switch to the next layer for my images. I'm first going to do the leaves, and once I have the next layers of the leaves mounted on my clear blocks, I'm going to use the second blue color. I'm using ocean waves and I'm going to add the second layer to my leaves. I'm working in clusters or in groups here. I'm first adding the second layer to one leaf design, then to the next leaf design, and so on. I feel this makes the stamping go a little faster. Patterns like this often do take quite a bit of time to stamp, so using a system is rather helpful. Once the leaves are stamped, and I'm only using 2 layers for the leaves. I don't want to add the 3rd layer and make my pattern too dark. So I'm going to switch to the 2nd layer for the roses and start stamping those. I'm using 2 different color combos for the roses. The large one will be stamped in one color, and the 2 smaller roses will have a different color, and I'll mention those in just a second. So I'm first going to stamp the large rose, and for the 2nd layer of the large rose, I'm using Peach Perfect color and simply stamping the 2nd layer over the first one. Now, I've used this stamp set so many times that I don't need to spend much time aligning layers. It's actually a pretty easy one to align, so I'm just quickly eyeballing where the 2nd layer has to go. I'm going to go ahead and finish this flower, and we'll stamp the 3rd layer using rouge. Now this looks darker than it actually is, or I should say it looks darker while it's wet. After the ink dries, it will lighten up just a little bit and the colors won't be as intense. Finally, we need to stamp the 2nd and the 3rd layers for the other 2 roses, and I'm using Frosty Pink and Cotton Candy for that. The idea is the same, so stamp 1 flower at a time to make it easier, or like 1 flower design at a time to make it easier and simpler and faster. So I'm going to speed this up quite a bit so you can see the stamping process, and as I do my stamping, you can really see this pattern to change and begin to look like a vintage piece of fabric. I love using vintage roses stamp set to stamp patterns like this one. It never fails me. Now this pattern is almost done. I finished stamping the flowers, but there's still quite a bit of space left in between the images. I'm going to fill in that space with some smaller images, and I'm going to use the vintage flowers stamp set for that. But you can use any set really. You just need to find a couple of small images. This particular set has a lot of fun little flower centers that fill in the space nicely. So I'm using several different images and several colors of ink, still the same colors that I used to stamp the roses, and I'm filling in the background with those images. I'm starting with the largest one, and I used rouge color for that one. Next, I'm using smaller one and stamping it in Perfect Peach. And for the last one, the smallest image, I'm using Cotton Candy color. I'm going to next die cut my stamped panels, and I'm cutting a circle and a square window, just something to add some interest to the background. I'm creating a spotlight. I'm not actually going to have a window on my card. I'm going to also stamp a sentiment, and like I said, you can use whatever sentiment you want. Anything goes nicely with patterns like these, so maybe a birthday sentiment or a wedding sentiment or an anniversary one, really just about anything. I'm using a superscript stamp set and stamping hello, and I'm using my mini MISTI to stamp it as I want to double stamp this image. I'm using rouge ink, and I'm actually going to stamp this image twice as I need 2 hellos, one for each of my cards. I'm going to die cut this using a matching die, and I've also die cut an identical hello out of scrapbook adhesive's foam adhesive sheets. I needed to do that to be able to add dimension to my die cut. You can skip this and use foam adhesive, but for die cuts like this, I prefer to die cut an identical one out of double-sided adhesive foam. If you don't have this particular adhesive foam from scrapbook adhesives, you can cut one out of regular foam and just adhere your stamped and die cut sentiment or word on top of it, on top of the foam, or add adhesive sheets to the foam to make it sticky. Or, skip entirely if you don't like to add dimension to your project. Now, I don't want the cards to just say hello, so I'm using additional sentiments from the Painted Butterflies stamp set, and I'm heat embossing them in platinum embossing powder onto a strip of white cardstock. I'm using You Inspire Me and also You Are Awesome. I'm not going to show you the heat embossing part in detail, as I show that in pretty much every video that I do, and it's very easy to do, and I really don't want to repeat the same information over and over again. To put my cards together, I've adhered my stamped panels onto an A2 white top folding card basis. I foam mounted the die cut circle and square on top of the card bases in the negative space. That created a spotlight. And now I'm adhering the die cut and stamped hello onto the foam adhesive hello to create a dimensional die cut. I'm going to adhere that onto my spotlight circle, and we'll add the additional heat emboss sentiment on top. To finish these cards, I decorated them with a few copper sequins and also added several clear drops from Pretty Pink Posh. So this finishes these vintage stamped pattern cards. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. The supplies I used to create these cards are listed in the video description and in the blog post. If you like this video and would like to see more videos like this, please give it a thumbs up and share with a crafty friend who is also a fan of stamping. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time. Bye!